So we're learning in this mimer the significance of the additional section that we say on Shabbos Mincha. And we outlined how this paragraph, starting with Ata Echa, V'Shimcha Echa, V'Yikam Yisrael Echa Ba'aretz, has really four sets of three. The Ata Echa set of three, Teres Gedula, Teres Yeshua, that set of three, Avram Yigel, Yitzchak Yiranein, that set of three, Menuchas Avu Nadava, Menuchas Emes Be'emuna, that set of three. So we have four sets of three. And we explained that each set of three is a reference to Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes. Well, why do we have it four times? Because there's four dimensions, so to speak, of Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes. We have the first dimension that we spoke a lot about, Ata Echad, Shimcha Echad, Mika Amcha Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz, which is a Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes, Koidim HaTzimtzum. Before anything, what is there? God, primordial. Prior to any constriction, there's the Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes. And then there's the first revelation of Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes after the Tzimtzum. Tiferes Gedula, Teres Yeshua. That's Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes in Adam Kadmon. I'm sure you've seen that term in somewhere in Chassidus. Adam Kadmon is the first revelation of Hashem's will. So the first revelation of Hashem's will after the Tzimtzum, going all the way down until Keser of Atzilus. That whole godly dimension, Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, that's the second set. The third set, Avram Yigel, Yitzchak Yiranein, Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes of Atzilus. Okay. And the last set, Menuchas Avu Nadava, Menuchas Emes Be'emuna, that is a Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes as it descends from Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes of Atzilus to Netzach, Chod, and Yesod of Atzilus. Okay. And then we spent a long time last week understanding, what does this mean? Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, Kodim HaTzimtzum. The whole idea of Kodim HaTzimtzum is there's Eibishter and nothing else. There's nothing you're relating to. Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes is a kli. It means there's a constricted godliness and an even more constricted godliness. So the godly energy can relate outward bound, creation, right? The other, the else of creation. Prior to creation, prior to Tzimtzum Harishon, when there's Hashem and Hashem and Hashem, and that's it, there's nothing. There are no spheros. There's nothing. There's no malachim. There's no ilamais. There's no dimensions. There's no tzimtzum. There's no constriction of God's energy. So what's this Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes business? The Rebbe proved to us that there has to be a Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes Kodim HaTzimtzum, because looking at the concept of Tzimtzum Harishon is what emerges from Atzmos Malchus Kodim HaTzimtzum, from Hashem himself. And Hashem himself, who is by definition only and all good, and Teva Tov L'Heitiv, the nature of one who is good is to do good, Hashem doing good creates Tzimtzum, because through Tzimtzum Harishon, we ultimately can come to a human being, a Jew on planet Earth, us, creation, humans, the ability to serve, the ability to give, the ability to create a skafianis hapcha, a new dimension of godliness. All of this is a manifestation of Hashem's goodness. Why did Hashem create from his goodness? So that means there was chesed prior to Tzimtzum Harishon, because that chesed is the catalyst for Tzimtzum Harishon. It's a tzimtzum, which might sound strange to be coming from chesed, but the tzimtzum is for the purpose of gilui. Only when you have tzimtzum harishon can you have the gilui, can you have the revelation, can you have creation. If you don't have tzimtzum harishon, you can't have creation. So if you don't have a tzimtzum, you can't have a gilui. And of course, in our lives too, we go through many things that look like a tzimtzum. Every tzimtzum, it's got to be a gilui, right? You read the Tzorach Aliyah, you only go down to go up, because a Jew never goes down. Every tzimtzum is for a gilui. Every tzimtzum is fueled by chesed, which means kodim tzimtzum harishon, there had to be chesed. And the Rebbe says, kodim tzimtzum harishon, there had to be gevura, because simply speaking, tzimtzum harishon is gevura. So there has to be chesed kodim tzimtzum harishon, because the chesed is what motivates the tzimtzum to have the gilui. There has to be gevura kodim tzimtzum harishon, because tzimtzum harishon is gevura. And if you have chesed, you have gevura, you have to have tiferes, right? That's the perfect blending of chesed and gevura. So there has to be chesed, gevura, and tiferes, kodim tzimtzum harishon. But not chesed, gevura, tiferes as we understand it, because yes, there are no spheros then, there are no worlds then, there are no celestial beings then. It's Eibishter, like God, no godliness, God. So it's really the potential which will be manifest post Tzimtzum Harishon as this full-fledged energy of Chesed Gvur Tiferes. And so we have that Chesed Gvur Tiferes in a very incipient state prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. There's nothing there to benefit from, appreciate, receive. It's Hashem. But within Hashem is the potential that will become Chesed, and the potential will become Gvur, and the potential will become Tiferes. So high that, again, it can't even exist as Chesed Gvur Tiferes. It's so Hashem. And then post Tzimtzum Harishon, we have the first manifestation of Chesed Gvur Tiferes in what we call Adam Kadmon, not what we call, what Kabbalah calls, what Chassidus refers to as Adam Kadmon, primordial man, the Ratzon Ha'elyon, the supernal will, all the way from Adam Kadmon through Keser Vatzilus, Chesed Gvur Tiferes. And then we have the other two levels within Atzilus, Chesed Gvur Tiferes, and within Atzilus, Netzach Yosef. Then the Rebbe questioned, and this is really the point we're up to. On one hand, in the Maimer, it explains, of course, piggybacking on prior Maimer, that in the Tefillah, we use the word Nasata, Tiferes Gedula, Teres Yeshua, Nasata. And Nasata means like giving over from one rishus to another. You gave, you transferred. It's probably the best way to explain it. So it's like, oh, that's interesting. Because first we have the Ata Echad Shem Checham like Echad Ba'aretz Echad because it's Kaidim Tzimtzum Rishon. There's nothing but God Himself. It's all one. No coloration, no differentiation, no distinguishing God. And then there's Nasata. There's a Nisina, a transfer of that energy to the Chesed Gvur Tiferes post Tzimtzum Harishon, from Adam Kadmon till Keser Vatzilus, Ratzon Ha'elyon till Keser Vatzilus, and that Chesed Gvur Tiferes has received from its Nasata. There was a transfer from Rishus to Rishus, from one domain to another domain, from the prior to Tzimtzum Harishon domain to the post Tzimtzum Harishon domain. Okay, but we have a problem. What's the problem? Because we're told that there's no erech, there's no value, there's no comparison from the Ne'etzalim, from that which evolved from Atzilus, which means the lower domains of Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, and obviously Asiya Gashmi, to that which it emerged from Atzilus itself. So within the worlds of Tikkun, within the Seder Hishtalshalos, rectification, we've got Atzilus, and then imagine, I used to call it an iron curtain, but that mushal expired many years ago. Iron curtain, and then we have Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. Like tremendous par. Such a tremendous par that the quote is given that there's no comparison. Even though Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya emerged from Atzilus, no comparison of the energy of Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya to Atzilus. But even more so, even more than the no comparison of Bria, Yitzira, Asiya to Atzilus is the no comparison of Atzilus to the Ein Sof that preceded Atzilus. Meaning basically, and of course there are, Kabbalah gives levels and terms and names that we don't usually reference in Chassidus so much, because Chassidus is more like practical. The focus is on planet Earth, on us. So putting it very simplistically, because that's the easiest and best way to do it, we have Hashem, Kaidim Tzimtzum Harishon, Atzmos Malchus. Then we have Tzimtzum Harishon, first primordial construction. And that created what's called the halal, like, you squeeze yourself into an outfit that doesn't really fit anymore. So Hashem is like, so to speak, sucking in his energies to make a place a little less intently him. That's the halal, the void, which isn't a void, of course. It's very, very intense godly energy, but less intense than prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. Within that halal, there emerges this piercing through what we call the kav, that first beam of creative energy, which evolves on many, many, many levels until we get to the beginning of what could be a world. As we refer to them in reference to Yaakov Avinu's sheep, we have Akudim, Nikudim, and Brudim. We have the first domain of a world where we're told, well, there's a concept of 10 spheres, but they're all in one, like 10 in one. So just beginning. And then after that, we have the emergence of, oh, this is a real world. This is actually called the world of Toihu. We have 10 distinct spheres, but of course, as we all know, with ultra intense lights in pretty flimsy vessels, no hiskalalus, no merging of those energies to create crash, Shviras HaKelim. The Eiros of Toihu ascend back to the infinity state, and the Kelim fall into the next domain, which is what we call Eilos of Tikkun, rectification, to pick up those shards that fell from Taihu, Seder Hishtalshalos, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, Asiyah. So, in simplistic terminology, everything higher than Keser Atzilus is like Ein Sof. I mean, you again, Kabbalah can give many terms, many levels, but it's like almost like whatever. It's all limitless. It's all Ein Sof. The highest level of Atzilus within Keser Atzilus has two levels. The higher level is Atik, the lower level is Arich. Atik of Atzilus, which is the highest point within Tikkun, the highest point within Seder Shtalshalos, is like, so to speak, called the end of Creator, if you will, which then descends to Arich of Keser Atzilus, where it's like the beginning of creation, which is all the rest of Seder Shtalshalos down to us, physicality. So I told you there's Atzilus, then like tremendous barrier or constriction or totally different reality. And we have Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah. And we know Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah have like no relationship to Atzilus. They're so different. They already could have Gan Edens and chambers and angels, lots of things going on, all godly things. But things in Atzilus, it's just God. It's Eitzel, it's Ne'etzel. It's literally just like the Eibishter himself. So there's no relationship of Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah to Atzilus, but there's much more no relationship of Atzilus to everything that preceded that, to all of Ein Sof, which is why I went into this, to understand what that terminology means. So everything, if you want to call it, Taihu, Akudim and Nekudim, all the levels, Halal, Kav, all Rotan Alyon, all Ein Sof. Ein Sof. So yeah, Bia, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah have no relationship to Atzilus, but Atzilus has far more no relationship to Ein Sof. And the Rebbe says, we compare to Ein Sof. We don't compare to God, Kaidim Tzimtzum Harishon, Hashem before the primordial contraction. We compare to the Ein Sof godly energies. So if Atzilus has more of a no relationship to Ein Sof, then Bia, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah have to Atzilus. Does Atzilus have any relationship to Atzmus Mahos Kaidim Tzimtzum Harishon, to the Eibishter himself, God himself before the primordial contraction? Of course not. So then how in the world can we say Nasata? There was Chesed Gevur and Tiferes prior to Tzimtzum Harishon, which we understand is exactly Chesed Gevur Tiferes as we understand it, but it's like the beginnings. And Nasata, that went over to the next Rishus of Chesed Gevur Tiferes post Tzimtzum Harishon. How could that be if there's no relationship? Like, no way could there possibly be a transfer of prior Tzimtzum Harishon to post Tzimtzum Harishon. But on the other hand, that's what we're saying the word Nasata means. So on one hand, it means it. So there was a transfer from Rishus to Rishus. On the other hand, that's impossible because even Ein Sof is wildly beyond all this, let alone Kaidim Tzimtzum Harishon. That is exactly where we're up to. Like, I don't even know if we really explained that question so much last week. Maybe at the very end, we started with this question, which we're going to be answering and continuing in our remaining minutes. It basically says, whatever is there, Kaidim Tzimtzum Harishon, did not transfer to post Tzimtzum Harishon. Like, no way. Impossible. Like we said, comparing Atzilus to impossible. No. All right, well, that makes sense. But then why do we say Nasata means? Not we. I mean, the Rebbe quoted it. The Rebbe said it. He's the one that taught it to us. Why is the Rebbe quoting and saying, oh, Nasata? Nasata means to move from Rishus to Rishus. So from Kodem Tzimtzum Harishon to Post Tzimtzum Harishon, when the Rebbe is saying, no way. So the Rebbe says, it's like there is a Giloi. There's a revelation of energy, but they don't have the energy. They just have the flow, the revelation of that energy. You say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Well, the Rebbe doesn't think you'd think it makes sense either. So the Rebbe gives two mishalim for us to understand, what does he mean? Yes, there's an asata, that's a legit word, which means a transfer from Rishus to Rishus. But no, there was no transfer from Rishus to Rishus. And nothing, Kodem Tzimtzum Harishon, got to post Tzimtzum Harishon. But there is some glow, energy, revelation that's transferring. What does that mean? So the Rebbe, the first mashal of the Rebbe is very interesting. The Rebbe says inside the word, says, as you say, the term crystal. It was actually very cute. I don't know if you want to call cute is the right word. I was reading a letter for someone this week, and I see this 2 words. I'm like, what is this? Bending my brain. And I'm like, oh, I'm saying to the person, you know what these 2 words are? Never seen it before in a letter. Any letter I've ever read, I've read many, many letters. Status quo. The Rebbe wrote out in Hebrew, status quo, twice in this letter. I'm like, okay, so here in our mimer, the Rebbe writes out crystal. So the Rebbe says, imagine you have a house of crystal walls. You live inside. You're inside this house, and the walls are crystal. And you can see through those crystal walls. You can see what's outside. I mean, the walls are crystal. They're transparent. You can see through everything, but you can't touch any of it. None of it's accessible to you because it's actually interesting because when I was first thinking of the mashal, I would think, you think we're outside and not in the house, but we're in the house because we're in the halal. We're in this little space that was created for creation. In other words, in our brain, if we created the mashal, we think it's a reverse. We're outside, and then there's that house, that like hallowed, sacrosanct territory, kodem simsim harishon. But that's not the truth. That's just our skewed perspective. The truth is, we're in this tiny little space, the halal, creation, and what's real is everything outside, kodem simsim harishon. So we're in the house, but the walls are crystal. So we could look and see all the magnificent, whatever you want to think of outside that house. You know, you got the Niagara Falls, you got the mountains, you got the valleys, you got whatever you want outside that house. And it's amazing. You could see it, but it's not yours. You can't touch it. You can't get it. You can't access it. You see it. There says, that's what we mean by Nasata here. Post Simsim Harishon, again, we're in the house. We could see the very beginning, post Simsim Harishon. We're talking about the Kav and the Halal and Adam Kadmon and even Kesser Vatzilos. We could see what's the real world. We see the Giluyim of prior to Simsim Harishon. We can't touch them. We can't get them. We don't have them. But we could see it. Like imagine the walls, you could see, but you can't get past it. That's the Nasata, the Rebbe says. And that mashal has a lot of power to it if you think about it. If you think about how like the inverse of how we would understand it versus what reality is. Then the Rebbe gives another mashal. And obviously each mashal has a certain strength. And obviously the Rebbe is giving too much shalom because these ideas are not so intuitive to us. The Rebbe says, simpler mashal, so to speak. You have a sefer and you're copying the sefer, right? Like how they originally copied the Tanya. There says this is actually a mashal for atik of Atzilus, which is interesting because the word atik, of course, on one hand, atik is the word old, like, old, primordial, Hashem himself. But a hetek, an otek is a copy. So it comes from that word also of copy. So there says you have a manuscript, you have a sefer, and you're copying it precisely. You write it word for word. This reminds me, this is not a copy, but just came into my head. I'm saying it in the Zechus of Rabbi Shusterman. This is totally parenthetical. Just was reminded by the word copy. It was a story of Rabbi Shusterman of Chicago, so I'll say it in his Zechus, that he was once told by the Rebbe, before he came out to Chicago, that you never daven Baal Peh. You always daven from a siddur. Okay, it's a Hira, and the Rebbe is always very into that, and you're always supposed to look inside, and that's a very strong point of the Rebbe. When you daven, you're supposed to look inside, see the words. Once he was stuck. It was like mincha any minute. He wasn't home. He wasn't in a shul. He was in a car somewhere, and he knew he had to daven, like, in the next few minutes. He wasn't close to, it wasn't like nowadays where you pull out your phone and you scroll and open up your, Tilas Hashem app. So this is 1950s. What did he do? Well, he had paper and pen in the car. So he wrote out the whole Shemona Esrei, and then he davened from those sheets. That the Rebbe said you never daven Baal Peh, you always daven looking inside. So he, by Baal Peh, wrote out the whole Shemona Esrei, and then he davened from those papers. Totally parenthetical, but what nice concept of a chassid listening to the rest of the Rebbe. So probably someone here, perhaps me, needed to hear that. So when you have an otek, you have a copy. You have the original sefer, you have the original manuscript, and then you copy it. Nowadays, we would think of like scanning it or a copier machine. Originally, it means you go by hand and copy word for word. And the end of the day, after you do that, you copy the entire sefer. What do you have? You have a copy. No, I have a sefer. No, you don't have a sefer. You have a copy, right? I mean, people do this all the time. I mean, in so many things that we can understand it more. Like if you think of the letters, my husband has all the letters. I think there were Moshe Shayevitz. I think it was Moshe Shayevitz, some old Chicago chassid who received many letters from the Rebbe and the Rebbe Rayatz. And my husband has a whole binder, nice, like clear, transparent sheets, all the letters. But he doesn't have the letters. They're all copies. He doesn't have the originals, but he has all the letters. But he doesn't have the letters at all. He has copies. So when you take a manuscript and you faithfully copy it word for word, or for that matter, you photocopy it nowadays, you still don't have the real deal. You have a copy, only a copy. Well, that has a lot. It does, but it doesn't have the energy of the real thing. Like we can understand if we're thinking of like my husband's very well preserved copies of the Rebbe letters. Only a copy. The Rebbe letter, true, but it's only a copy. So the Rebbe is saying, similarly, we think of the Sfiros post Tzimtzum Harishon, Chesed Gvur Tiferes. They're a copy, like Atik, from that same shorosh of copy. They're a copy of Kodim Tzimtzum Harishon. So again, that's has a lot of power in both directions. On one hand, wow, they're a copy of prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. That's amazing. On the other hand, they're only a copy. The original energy isn't there. When you have a copy of a letter of the Rebbe, you don't have the letter of the Rebbe. The energy of that letter isn't there. You have a copy. Everyone has their own mitzvahs they create and believe in. So once I was in Crown Heights, and I don't know his name, but some guy, what does he do? What's his inyan? And you can never knock anyone else's inyan. He makes color copies of Rebbe dollars. He might even like put a picture of the Rebbe in it. I don't remember. And laminated. And I don't know if he sells them, he distributes them. I don't know. I mean, and he writes on top what each dollar is for, meaning what he did was, like, let's say someone has a Rebbe dollar, and through that Rebbe dollar, they had this amazing miracle, right? Health, fertility, parnasa, whatever. He says, I want to make a copy of that dollar. So he makes a color copy, laminated. He makes many of them, and he writes on top, like, this dollar is for parnasa, this dollar is for children, this dollar is for health. And he, again, I don't know if he distributes them or sells them. I don't know. These copies, he really believes in it. And I'm not knocking him, because you can never knock someone's emunah. But if you look at it, you'd say, well, but it's not the Rebbe dollar. It's a copy of the dollar. He's like, yeah, and many good things happen from this copy. Okay, fine. I'm not arguing. But it's a copy. So on one hand, you look at it, it's the same thing. I mean, here it's not exactly the same thing. I think he's put some other writing on it. But it's pretty similar. Yeah, but it's a copy. Or my husband's letters. I mean, it's amazing. And he has all of them very bound and beautiful and preserved. And he really appreciates having them because they are the content of the letters. But the spiritual energy, it's a copy. So Chesed Gvur Tiferes post Tzimtzum Harishon are a copy of Chesed Gvur Tiferes prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. On one hand, wow, it's a copy. On the other hand, it's only a copy. It's not the real thing at all. Okay, we will stop at that point, and next week we will see what does all this have to do with us anyway.